The morning air at Black Rock Base was crisp and still, the kind of quiet that came before noise and motion. Harper Lane had already been up for hours, walking the perimeter with Bain trotting beside her ears, perked and movements measured. She moved like someone who knew exactly what she was doing and expected no one to notice. Her uniform was the standard gray utility, clean but unadorned. No rank patches, no flashy tech. Just a faded tag that read, "Handler in black thread." At her side, Bain sat alert, a 5-year-old Belgian Malinois with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. His stillness was almost unnatural, the result of hundreds of hours of discipline and trust. Most people didn't see either of them. Harper wasn't part of the operations meetings or command briefings. Her job officially was support. She handled canine logistics, managed training cycles, made sure her dog was mission ready. But unofficially, she knew these grounds better than most. She had tracked storms and soil shifts, watched the way wind moved through the canyons, memorized the terrain like it was her own skin. When the SWAT team arrived, everything changed. They rolled in with armored trucks and loud voices, radios, squawking boots hitting pavement like war drums. Their gear gleamed with polished arrogance. Tactical suits molded to muscled frames, helmets under arms, patches stitched like trophies. They moved like they belonged everywhere, and everyone else didn't. One of them, a tall man with a shaved head and mirrored sunglasses, caught sight of Harper standing near the kennels. He smirked, then turned to his team. "Morning, crate girl." The others laughed, a rough burst of noise that bounced off the concrete walls. Harper didn't flinch. She was used to being background noise. She glanced down at Bain, who didn't move, but whose ears twitched slightly. He had learned her cues, recognized tension the way other dogs chase toys. She stepped aside as the men moved past her, their voices loud enough to hear, their words sharp enough to wound. Another one, younger and trying too hard, pointed toward Bain. "Is that the mutt handler support runs around with?" More laughter. Someone added something about kibble and paperwork, and it stuck. They started calling her that. Kibble girl. Paperwork patrol. Not with hate exactly. Just the casual disrespect of people who didn't think you mattered. Harper didn't respond. Not with words. She walked Bain to the side gate, made a quiet note in her logbook, and resumed her checks. The dogs needed rotation. One was favoring its back leg. Another needed to be rescheduled for search drills. She didn't need their approval. She told herself that every day. The leader of the SWAT team, Detective Jack Morgan, never spoke directly to her unless he had to. When he did, it was always clipped and loud, like barking a command across a field. "You got a kennel right?" he asked one morning while strapping into a harness. "Keep your mutt out of our AO. Last thing I need is your dog tripping over my men." She nodded once and said nothing. That was safer. Talking back never helped. You just gave them more material. Behind the silence, though, there was something else. Harper's mind didn't go still. It turned over wind directions, elevation shifts, smoke dispersal patterns. She noticed things the men didn't, like how the smoke machines left residue on the canyon walls, or how the eastern ridge eroded faster after the last rainfall. Small things, dangerous things, things she reported that no one ever read. She had filled 3 notebooks in the last 6 months, all of them marked in tidy, precise handwriting, all of them ignored. Torres, the team's second, liked to put his feet on the folding table where she kept the gear logs. He once joked that she was probably a diversity hire ticking some box in the HR file for gender inclusion, said it like a compliment, then laughed at his own wit. The others followed his lead. Harper's jaw tightened, but her face stayed calm. Bain's body shifted slightly, sensing her mood. He didn't growl. He didn't need to. He just looked up at her and waited. She crouched beside him and adjusted his harness. One loop was starting to fray. Small details saved lives. That was what she believed. She hadn't always been a handler. There was a time she had hiked into wildfire zones with nothing but a pack and a topographical map. Her breath, sharp in her lungs, and fear humming low in her chest. She knew how to listen to the land. The ground talked if you let it. At Black Rock, no one asked her what she saw. They gave her space and assumed it was emptiness. One afternoon, Torres stood near the equipment cage sipping a protein shake. He nodded toward Bain. "That mutt actually do anything? Or is he just a morale booster?" Peterson, the new guy, glanced from Bain to Harper and shrugged. "She looks like she's got something under control," he said carefully, not quite siding with anyone. Morgan laughed. She doesn't have a story, Peterson. She's not a badass handler from the movies. She's here for the optics, keeps the paperwork flowing, stays in the van when things get real. The words landed like gravel on bare skin. Harper bent to check Bain's pause hand's steady voice quiet. But inside something shifted. She didn't want to be their story. She didn't want a headline. But she was tired of being a shadow in the corner. The wind picked up as the sun dropped behind the ridge. Bain looked out over the canyon, his muscles taut, his eyes narrowing slightly. Harper stood beside him, one hand resting on his back. She didn't know what was coming, but she felt it. And this time she wouldn't stay in the van. The sun hadn't fully risen when Harper stepped out of her trailer and felt it. The wind was wrong. It moved low across the dirt like a slow, warning curling dust along the canyon walls in patterns she didn't expect. She paused, holding her breath. Most people wouldn't notice the shift. It wasn't strong enough to stir flags or move branches, but Harper had spent years learning how to read the air. She watched the way it cut through the eastern ridge, dropping instead of rising. That meant pressure changes. That meant potential inversion. That meant danger. Bain stood at her side, unmoving but watchful. His nose twitched once, then again. His head tilted slightly toward the east where the fire simulation was scheduled for noon. Harper turned back toward the command tent. It wasn't much. Just a steel-framed structure with 2 laptops, and too many radios. She knew who was inside. Captain Sanders, the training coordinator, was running point today. She stepped in quietly and waited for him to finish barking directions at a logistics officer. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were already impatient. "Sir, there's a change in the wind pattern. It's early, but if it holds, it could affect the smoke dispersal in the canyon." He didn't blink. "Meteorology's not your lane, handler. I've mapped that canyon extensively. A shift like this could trap heat, especially with today's humidity." Sanders pulled off his headset and let out a long sigh. "Look, I get it. You're trying to be helpful. But we're on schedule and we've cleared all the risk protocols. Let the actual planners do the planning." Harper held her ground for another second, then nodded. "Understood." Back outside, she took a breath. The wind touched her cheek again, warmer now. It was rising, pushing from the west instead of the north. That meant turbulence in the canyon. It meant the smoke they planned to use for realism could pool instead of scatter. She didn't argue. She didn't storm out. She walked back to her van and opened the side door. Bain jumped in first and settled onto his mat, but he stayed alert. Harper slid behind the small desk she had rigged out of a surplus crate and opened her field notebook. The maps inside were hers. Every line hand-drawn. She had layered wind trends over elevation, added thermal notations with color-coded pens. She flipped to the page for the eastern canyon. Then with red ink, she updated the current direction of airflow. Arrows sweeping downward. A ring around the danger zone. Bain shifted beside her. His head rested on his paws, but his ears were angled back, listening. He didn't need words. He picked up everything from her breathing, from how tightly she gripped her pen. Harper looked at the time. Just after 8. The simulation wasn't set to begin for hours, but the heat was already climbing. She stared at the map, imagining the smoke machines firing up, filling that tight space with synthetic fog. Under normal wind, it would flow cleanly through the canyon, rising out. But not with this pattern. Not today. She turned to her weather notes. The regional forecast had mentioned a late front, but local conditions were always trickier. BlackRock's terrain made weather unpredictable. That's why she kept her own records. And right now, those records were telling her something that the command tent refused to hear. Bain let out a low huff. Harper reached over and laid a hand on his neck. The short fur was warm. He was tense too. He didn't understand the details, but he understood her focus, her stillness, her worry. Outside, the base stirred to life. Trucks rumbled past. Voices crackled over radios. The SWAT team gathered near the staging area, checking gear and laughing, like this was any other training day. Harper closed her notebook and stared at nothing for a long second. It was always like this. She saw what others didn't. And still they looked past her. Because she wasn't loud. Because her title didn't have stripes. Because she carried a leash and a clipboard instead of a badge and a gun. But that didn't change what she knew. Something was wrong. Not in a dramatic, screaming kind of way. In the quiet, creeping way. The kind that builds until it snaps. Harper opened her laptop and began modeling airflow again. She couldn't stop the drill, but she could be ready. She could track the changes minute by minute, and if the worst happened, she would have the data, the maps, the plan. She looked down at Bain. He watched her steadily, his brown eyes full of trust. "We're going to stay ready," she said softly. He flicked his tail once in response. Harper glanced back at the canyon through the windshield. The sunlight was brighter now, and the dust swirled in tighter circles across the rock. She didn't need to be in the command tent to know what was coming. She already knew. At exactly noon, the Apache lifted into the sky with a low growl that vibrated through the canyon walls. The SWAT team lined up in formation, their gear clinking softly as they moved. From her position behind the equipment trailer, Harper watched them descend one by one into the narrow basin. The wind was already shifting. She felt it before she saw it, a subtle pull across her cheek that bent the tips of dry grass and scattered fine dust in lazy spirals. Bain stood beside her, rigid nose twitching as he caught something she couldn't yet name. The smoke machines began their cycle, and thick clouds poured into the canyon like waves. At first it was controlled, behaving as planned, but Harper noticed the movement was wrong. Instead of flowing up and out, it began folding back on itself, thickening between the rock walls. She lifted her binoculars and tracked the team below. They were moving confidently, checking corners, sweeping the area with practiced ease. Their radios clicked in routine intervals, voices steady, unaware. Harper adjusted the dial scanning channels. Everything sounded normal, but it wasn't. She looked back at her notebook, the last wind vector she'd recorded now matching exactly what she saw. The inversion was real. Warm air sat heavy at ground level, while cooler air above locked it in place. The smoke wasn't dispersing. It was settling. Bain took 2 steps forward and let out a short, sharp breath. Harper knelt beside him, scanning the sky. The sun was too still, the canyon too quiet. The smoke rose a few feet, then dropped like a blanket. Through the haze, she could just barely see Torres waving toward Peterson, the new recruit. Their voices came faintly through the radio, still calm, still in drill mode. They didn't know. Not yet. Harper felt it in her gut. This was no longer a simulation. The air was changing too fast. Visibility would vanish in minutes. Breathing would get harder. Navigation impossible. She glanced down at her watch. 12:08. Her hand moved instinctively to her radio, fingers pausing on the button. She hesitated. Every other time she had tried to warn them, she'd been cut off, dismissed, told to stay in her lane. But something in her wouldn't let go this time. Bain turned to her. His ears were forward. His body was still. Harper took a breath and whispered, "It's happening." The drill wasn't a drill anymore. It was becoming a trap. The smoke rolled thicker now, a dense wall creeping through the canyon like fog with a purpose. Harper watched as the black-clad figures below began to vanish one by one, swallowed by haze that wasn't behaving like smoke should. Bain shifted, tense and alert, his nose high and working non-stop. She flipped the emergency switch on her radio and keyed into the reserved channel. Her voice stayed calm, but every word carried urgency. She explained the heat inversion, the wind shift, the canyon's trap. Before she could finish, a cold voice cut through the static. Handler Lane returned to standard frequency. "This is not for training use." "This isn't training anymore," she said quietly, her thumb still on the button. The response came back hard and fast. "Report to the command post immediately. You are in violation of protocol." Harper closed her eyes for half a second. Then she grabbed her notebook, turned on her heel, and walked straight toward the command tent. Smoke was starting to stretch over the staging area, now turning sunlight gray. Officers moved faster. Radios buzzed louder. She spotted Detective Lisa Morgan just outside the main table setup. Morgan was flipping through satellite overlays, frustration building with every page. Harper stepped in front of her, holding out the notebook. "You need to see this." Morgan looked up, skeptical and distracted. Then her eyes dropped to the notebook. The map was detailed, precise, and annotated with red ink and tight handwriting. Arrows, timestamps, hazard zones. Harper's finger landed on a thin route sketched along the canyon's edge. "That's a secondary access. It's below the current smoke line. It bypasses the unstable slope. I've tracked its erosion patterns for over a year." Morgan studied it, her brow furrowing. A pause settled between them, the kind where decisions hang in the air. Behind her, someone yelled about a dropped signal. Another officer cursed as a GPS locked up. Harper kept her voice low and level. "The smoke is building faster than they expected. The standard extraction path won't work. If we don't act now, they're going to lose more than comms. Morgan didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she looked back at the notebook and finally nodded once. Tell me everything you know. For the first time, someone in command had stopped talking long enough to listen, and Harper, steady and certain, began to speak. The rotor blades chopped through thick air as the Apache lifted off the helipad, the world below, already blurred by smoke. Harper sat behind the pilot headset on maps rolled beside her. Bain crouched low at her feet. The dog was still, but his nose twitched constantly, his body wired tight like a drawn bow. Lieutenant Morrison flew the bird, his voice clipped and skeptical. His co-pilot, Warrant Officer Chun, watched Harper with polite doubt. Neither man had expected a handler to be their guide. Harper didn't try to win them over. She laid out the map across her lap and pointed to the ridge. You'll want to enter from the north side, she said calmly. Follow the slope until the tree line ends, then drop low. The smoke's pooling in the canyon base. Visual's going to be gone in 60 seconds. Morrison hesitated, then adjusted course. Beneath them, the ridge narrowed and curved. Visibility dropped fast. Harper tracked familiar rocks. Subtle terrain breaks, her memory doing the work. Instruments couldn't. The helicopter rocked slightly as wind shifted. Smoke spilled in sideways, thick and brown. Bain moved, head snapping toward the right window. A low whine came from his chest. Harper leaned forward. East Bend. They're close. Drop 30 feet. Chun looked at her like she'd lost her mind. You sure? Harper nodded once. Trust the dog. They dipped low, skimming the treetops. The smoke broke just enough for a glimpse of movement below. A flash of black gear, someone waving slowly. Peterson, the youngest in the team. He staggered toward a boulder, then dropped to one knee. Contact, shouted Morrison. I've got movement. The radio buzzed with static. Chunks of desperate speech cut in and out. Harper could make out Webb's voice, hoarse and strained. Smoke. No GPS. One down. Harper scanned the ground. She spotted a narrow bank beside the creek bed. Not much room to land, but it would have to do. Set down there. Between those trees, you've got 10 feet clearance. Morrison didn't answer. He just did it. The Apache descended the rotors, stirring up ash and dust, the skids settling hard on uneven ground. Harper unbuckled, grabbed her medkit and signal flags, and looked at Bain. Find them. The dog leapt from the craft like a shadow. Harper followed, boots crunching against gravel, eyes locked on Bain's tail. The world smelled like burnt wires and wet rock. Her lungs burned. She pushed through it. Bain barked once, short and urgent. Harper turned the corner of a rock outcrop and saw them. Webb leaning against a rock, his face streaked with soot. Torres kneeling beside Peterson, who lay flat on his back. Two more operators stood in a loose defensive posture, disoriented and coughing. Harper crouched and checked Peterson's vitals, weak but steady. She looked at Webb. We're getting you out. He didn't argue, just nodded. Harper signaled the Apache crew. Morrison and Chun moved fast, securing lines and clearing space. The loading was rough. Visibility worsened by the second. Still, they got everyone in. Bain jumped in last, panting but focused. As they lifted off, Morrison's voice came through the headset. We never would have found them without you. Harper didn't answer. She just looked out the window down at the canyon that had nearly buried 5 lives in silence. And she thought quietly, it had listened to her after all. Harper stood outside the colonel's office, her boots quiet on the tile floor. The base was still buzzing from the rescue, but this hallway was silent. Bain sat beside her, alert, but calm, as if he understood that what came next mattered just as much as what they had just done. The door opened with a soft click. Colonel Hayes didn't look up right away. He was standing by the window, arms folded, the morning sun catching on the metals lined neatly behind his desk. When he finally turned, his face was unreadable. Handler Lane, he said. Sit. Harper stepped in, sat straight, and waited. I've read 3 reports this morning, he said, keeping his voice level. All of them say the same thing. You violated direct protocol, accessed emergency frequencies without clearance, and inserted yourself into a mission without authorization. She didn't flinch. Yes, sir. They also say you saved 5 lives using knowledge that wasn't part of any official briefing. Tactical awareness, geological precision, a coordinated air rescue based on terrain memory and canine tracking. He paused. That accurate? She nodded. It is. Hayes walked back to his desk and opened a file. Your background includes a master's in geological surveying, Forest Service search and rescue, high-altitude operations. Your evaluations are excellent. So tell me, why are you listed here as handler support?" Harper met his eyes. "Because no one asked for more." The colonel closed the file slowly and leaned forward. "That ends now." She blinked once, unsure she heard right. "You're being reassigned effective immediately to tactical search and rescue operations, full clearance. You'll work directly with joint operations as a terrain and extraction specialist." Harper sat still for a moment longer, the weight of it settling in. "Yes, sir." Colonel Hayes nodded once. "You earned it. Not with politics, not with noise. You earned it with competence. That's hard to ignore even in this place." As Harper stood to leave, he looked up again. "Good work, Specialist Lane." She stepped out into the hallway with Bain at her side, her name and title finally lined up with who she had always been. And for the first time since she arrived at Blackrock, she walked like someone who belonged. Harper noticed the shift the next morning. Webb caught up to her near the field lockers, not with a joke or smirk, but a question. He wanted her opinion on a slope reading for an upcoming field op. She answered plainly, pointing out the weak soil near the southern ridge. Webb nodded, listening, not pretending he already knew. It was the first time he treated her like part of the team. By the end of the week, 2 more officers had quietly asked her to walk them through topographic changes along the canyon rim. Peterson brought her coffee without being asked. Even Morrison, the Apache pilot, stopped by with a flight map and a half smile. Respect was a strange thing when it finally arrived. It came softly, but it carried weight. Not everyone was on board. Torres passed her twice without a word. When she entered the comms tent, one of the newer techs stopped talking mid-sentence and turned away. She caught snippets of things when they thought she wasn't listening. Words like lucky, overhyped, dangerous. Harper didn't confront them. She just noted it, folded it into the shape of her new reality. Recognition wasn't clean. It came with shadows. At night, she updated her maps in silence, Bain resting at her feet. She felt the pressure growing, the expectation to keep proving herself. Every correction she offered, every step she made in a room, all eyes waited to see if she would trip. She didn't, but she felt the cost. Respect, she was learning, didn't always come with ease. Sometimes it came with eyes behind your back, but she was ready for that too. The knock came just after dusk, 3 sharp raps on the metal door of her cabin at the edge of Blackrock. Harper opened it to find 2 men in dark suits, one older with a tired face, the other younger but tense, both clearly not from the base. They introduced themselves, without flourish, and asked if they could speak inside. She led them in, offered coffee they didn't accept, and stood by the small table where her maps were spread out. The older one, Agent Connors, got to the point. A federal witness had gone missing 3 days ago during a transfer. She vanished in the Cascades in terrain too unstable for a drone sweep and too remote for standard teams. The chopper dropped her with 2 marshals. Only 1 marshal made it out. No sign of the witness since. Harper listened without interrupting, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. Bain lay near the heater but didn't sleep. His ears flicked with every word. Connors pulled a photograph from his folder and slid it across the table. "She asked for you." Harper picked it up slowly. The woman was older now, with sharper lines around her eyes and a hint of fear behind her smile. But Harper knew her, knew the way her hand had gripped a broken branch years ago, clinging to the edge of a landslide, while Harper had dug her out with bare hands and a makeshift harness. She was a forest hiker then, just a name on a dispatch call. But Harper had found her, stabilized her, and stayed until help came. They hadn't spoken since. Until now. Harper placed the photo down and nodded once. "You think she's alive?" Connors didn't hesitate. "If she is, we're running out of time." Harper moved to her gear rack and began pulling her pack together. Rope, thermal blankets, satellite beacons. She moved without rushing, but with purpose. The younger agent looked at her with a mix of awe and concern. Connors watched her quietly. "You don't have to say yes. She just hoped you would." Harper stopped, her hand resting on Bain's collar. She thought about the rock slide, the cold, the way that woman had looked at her after she pulled her free. Not like a hero, more like an answer. She didn't need to speak. Her actions already had. "Let me see the terrain files," she said. Connors handed her a drive. She plugged it in and began scanning elevation maps and last known pings. The range was brutal. Snowline high paths faded, but there was a pattern. She saw it before she even knew what she was looking at. She turned back to them. "We'll leave before sunrise." The younger agent blinked. "We—" Harper glanced at Bain, who was already on his feet. "I don't do rescues alone." They left without ceremony. Just quiet thanks and a firm handshake. Harper locked the door behind them and sat for a moment in the stillness. The fire cracked low. Her fingers rested on the photo again. Some debts don't ask to be paid. They call you when it matters most, and when they do, you go. The snow came down in tight spirals, pushed sideways by a wind that howled through the trees like it carried secrets. Harper moved ahead of the team steps, sure despite the whiteout. Her map was committed to memory. She wasn't watching the trail. She was watching how the trail disappeared. Bain led the way, nose close to the frozen ground, his gait changing with every new scent. They'd picked up something 3 miles back. Not just a trail, but a mix of diesel fumes and human sweat. Faint, but real. The scent line broke near a rocky ridge where the snow had gathered in unnatural drifts. Harper signaled for a pause, crouched by a narrow cleft in the rock, and brushed away the top layer. Beneath it, a boot print, recent, too deep to be from a solo hiker, too careless to be from trained personnel. She ran her glove over a scuff mark on a nearby boulder. Fresh, drag pattern. Someone was injured or being pulled. The others stayed back. They trusted her lead now. The agent beside her didn't speak, just watched, breath visible in the cold air. Harper pointed toward a slope that led into dense pine cover. Natural windbreak. Good concealment. She moved forward. Bain stopped. Head up, ears stiff. Then he turned sharply left, bolting into a low outcrop barely visible through the storm. Harper followed the snow, swallowing their tracks as fast as they made them. The terrain dipped sharply, then flattened. A long shadow formed across a sheet of ice. A cave mouth half covered by brush and snow. She dropped to one knee and pressed a hand to the ground. Heat still lingered. Not from the earth. From people. Multiple bodies. Recently. Bain growled low and uncertain. She motioned for silence. Faintly from within the cave came a voice. Not panicked, just quiet, resigned. Then another voice. Male. Clipped. Commanding. Harper's pulse slowed. This wasn't a rescue anymore. It was a standoff. The witness wasn't alone, and whoever was inside with her wasn't there to help. She turned to the agent beside her and whispered, "They're in there. We've got maybe minutes to plan." The snow didn't matter now. The mountain didn't matter. Only the choices they made next. Harper crouched at the cave entrance, fingers brushing the icy stone. Inside, the voices echoed off the walls, distorted but distinct. She mapped the space in her mind, calculating every bounce of sound, every blind turn in the rock. She turned to the agent behind her and whispered directions. No radios, only hand signals. This was going to be about timing and silence. She drew a line in the dirt with her glove marking entry paths, zones of cover fallback points. Then she motioned for Bain. He crept ahead low and steady, pausing at each sound. Harper sent him left through a narrow crawl space she'd spotted earlier. It would lead to a small chamber above the captors. She reached into her vest, pulled a thin flash stick, and placed it near a rock mound. One spark, one echo. That's all they would need. At her signal, the agents moved into place. 3 paths, 1 goal. Harper waited until Bain's soft bark echoed once from above. That was the mark. She struck the flash and tossed it hard against the far wall. The pop cracked through the cave like thunder. Shouts followed. Footsteps scrambled. 2 figures rushed toward the distraction guns up. That was their mistake. The agents swept in from opposite sides, cutting off escape routes with silent precision. One man tried to fire, but his shot hit stone. The sound exploded around them, blinding and deafening. It was chaos for them. For Harper, it was a map unfolding exactly as planned. She slipped into the back corridor, the one they hadn't guarded. She moved fast, hugging the wall heart steady. Ahead, a small figure sat bound near a lantern. It was the witness. Her head turned at the sound of Harper's boots. Harper reached her, cut the zip ties, and whispered, "Can you walk?" The woman nodded, shaking but alive. Harper pulled her to her feet and led her through the tight passage she'd scouted earlier. Bain met them halfway, tail low, ears still high. He had done his part. Behind them, the final sounds of surrender echoed. The FBI moved in, taking the last man down without a shot fired. Harper didn't stop to watch. She guided the woman out through the snow tunnel, her breath-short eyes never leaving the path. They emerged into the cold light of morning. The storm had passed. So had the danger. Harper looked back once, not for glory, for confirmation. Everything had gone the way she saw it. Not luck, not instinct. Skill, planning, trust. That was what had saved them. 6 months later, Harper stood on the observation ridge at Black Rock watching a new class of handlers work their dogs through terrain drills. The wind moved slow and clean, carrying the sharp scent of pine and dust. She knew every dip of this ground, every sound it made underfoot. The recruits listened when she spoke. They wrote things down, not because she raised her voice, but because her words came with proof. She had walked where others wouldn't. Now they followed without question. Her methods had gone federal. Agencies requested her playbooks. Her maps were printed and laminated in field kits across 4 states. But Harper didn't think of that when she laced her boots each morning. She thought of the details, wind angles, soil memory, the small things that saved lives when nothing else could. Bain walked beside her slower now, but still alert. He carried silver around his muzzle like a medal earned in silence. He no longer needed to prove anything. Neither did she. The base had changed. She was no longer the woman people ignored in the background. Command asked for her by name. Pilots checked with her before every mission. New officers didn't laugh when she entered a room. They leaned forward. They listened. But Harper hadn't changed. She still kept her own field books, still trusted her gut before a satellite feed. She trained her teams with patience, with stories, with the quiet conviction that the best leaders don't lead from the front. They guide from where the trail begins. She kept a single photo on her cabin wall. It was her and Bain beside the Apache after the rescue. Dust streaked across her uniform, a faint smile on her face. Bain's ears up, eyes sharp. Behind them, the canyon stretched wide and endless. She looked at that photo often, not for pride, but for truth. She remembered the silence before people believed her, the names, the doubt, the way it felt to walk invisible through a place where only loud mattered. Now, when the wind shifted, when something subtle went wrong, they didn't ignore it. They looked to her. She placed her hand gently on Bain's back and whispered without needing to be heard. "We're not in the background anymore." That was enough. That was everything. Because the people who once walked past her now walked toward her, and when the storm came, when it was too dark or too cold or too late, they called one name. Not because she talked the loudest, but because she always knew the way out. And if anyone asked her what she'd learned through all of it, she would say one simple thing: be the quiet that still holds the light.